She can go on Facebook.
Let's see. See if it works. Last time there was one false attempt, but I see a loading thing. I think we're good.
Sherry.
Okay.
Is Sherry on this? I see her name, but I don't see her.
That's.
Do you want me to go to the other computer?
Yes, we're good. All right. Welcome again, everyone. Today we are going to be discussing a topic that I'm very excited to be discussing with you. We're going to be looking at who controls the narrative, specifically focusing on the character of Mephibosheth, who, if you haven't spent any time studying him before, you are going to get quite a crash course today. And I have to acknowledge that today is Yom HaShoah, and I am not teaching about the Shoah. However, I do think that the idea of controlling a narrative and who tells a story and how trustworthy our news sources are, both has relevance when we're looking historically at the Shoah and also at our world today. And so I used to work at a synagogue where before they began any kind of Torah study, they asked if anyone wanted to dedicate our study. And I'd like to suggest that today we dedicate our study to the memory of all those lost in the Shoah. So if we could just have a moment, and then we'll say our Torah blessing and continue. All right. Please join me in the blessing over Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And we will get started with our text study. Beautiful. The screens are where they're supposed to be. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll begin. So some background information on this character that perhaps you've never heard of and perhaps you don't know how to spell. All of that is fair. So we know we're in 2 Samuel. The first king of Israel is Saul. Saul has a sizable family, including his son Jonathan. Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son. So we're talking about Saul's grandson. And Mephibosheth, we'll see, enters right as things are looking pretty bad for the Saul family. David has been warring and is victorious ultimately. And we are introduced to the character of Mephibosheth at that moment. I think the rest of the historical information probably isn't so new for anyone, but I want to make sure it's on the screen for long enough for everyone to take a look. Hopefully it all makes sense, and we will continue. So we are going to be looking at who is telling this story. Whose perspective are we hearing from? Mephibosheth, we're going to see very quickly, gets injured, and this injury becomes a topic of great conversation throughout his multiple appearances in 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel, it's also worth noting, if you're thinking about the documentary hypothesis, it's one of the Deuteronomistic, say that 5 times fast, histories, which were generally understood to be written from the perspective of the Davidic dynasty and the supporters of the Davidic dynasty, which is always worth noting when we're looking at the power dynamics between especially the Saul family and the David family. Questions so far? Okay. Can everyone hear me? Am I moving too fast?
Oh, I can hear you. I may have to be out of the picture for a short while, but I'm listening.
Okay.
I don't know how to get on the picture thing.
Go to the, who said that?
Me, Sherry.
Oh, Sherry. Yeah, no,
I
Sherry.
can get on here. Only Jason's is the only one I can do to get on.
Huh. Let me try to start video from my end and see if that works, okay? It'll hopefully give you a pop-up with an invitation to start your video.
Start my video.
And then maybe you'll be able to see the screen. I'm not sure. Hi, there you are.
Hi, Sherry.
Okay, great. So with each text, we're going to be looking at these basic questions. Each time the text reminds us of Mephibosheth's injury, when Mephibosheth himself offers forth the information, and when someone else does. So who is talking about it? Why might the text or these individual characters be reminding us of this injury? And what is the power dynamic that we can perceive in these specific interactions that are going to come up? Okay? All right. So first, let's meet our hero. Would someone like to read 2 Samuel 4:4?
I will.
Thanks.
Okay. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son whose feet were crippled. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse picked him up and fled. But as she was fleeing in haste, he fell and was lamed. His name was
Mephibosheth.
Mephibosheth.
So I was mentioning earlier that when I was writing my thesis, he was one of the characters I focused on. It became very hard to talk about Mephibosheth because the Hebrew uses the word cripple and lame, and our modern style guides tell us not to use that terminology, that terminology is offensive and dated. However, that is what the Hebrew says. And so we will do our best to both be sensitive to the language we use and also be aware of Hebrew's limitations, especially biblical Hebrew, which has such a limited vocabulary. All right, so we have a child here. He's 5, and he gets dropped by someone who's so scared they're running and carrying a child. I was once on the subway, and I saw a man running and down the stairs and carrying a stroller with a kid in it, and I almost had a heart attack just watching. It was so scary. This isn't quite that bad, but this is really scary. And I think that piece can't be lost, that the reason they're fleeing is because they're actually fleeing. And catastrophic results. He is injured in a way that we are clear this is a significant injury, and we will see that it seems to be a permanent injury. Now, this is not a character telling us this. This is the voice of the text. So if we're going to look back at our questions, why are we being told about this?
Well, he plays a role because the family would normally kill out anybody from the opposite family.
Okay, so we have a power dynamic. David's forces are proving victorious, and we have the king and the king's oldest son. Now, I think Jonathan's the oldest. Now both dead. So in theory, potentially Mephibosheth could be the heir apparent. He does not become king, as we know. But this is a very important child who's just gotten significant political promotion, and then immediately suffers this catastrophic fall.
When they say crippled, what do they mean? Like what was his, what was wrong with him that made him crippled?
Great question.
Like, what's the difference between the cripple and the lame?
Great question.
Here?
Don't know.
Okay.
I assume, and this is how I ended up talking about it, that he suffered an injury to both his legs that resulted in some mobility challenges. What precisely? I'm not sure. But that there is a permanent injury to his legs is a fact we're going to be reminded of quite frequently. Okay.
Rabbi, was he crippled before the nurse picked him up and fled? Because the very first sentence says that Jonathan had a son who's
Great question.
Were crippled. So presumably he's got this malady even before he has to flee.
So that is one way to read the text, but also another way to read the text is we're going to tell you about this kid who gets injured. here's the information about the kid. He was 5 years old, and then his nurse picked him up, but then she dropped him, and that's why earlier we introduced him as saying he's got this injury.
Okay.
So Hebrew doesn't always go, and our text doesn't always go in a linear fashion. Often something will be introduced, and then you'll get the backstory. And that's my understanding of what the text is doing here, that there's this backstory that's getting explained. How was he crippled? Here's how he was crippled. Okay, so this is as a child of 5. We're going to jump forward in time. How much time? The answer probably is out there, but I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. Long enough for Mephibosheth to be older than 5, certainly. We're going to jump forward about 5 chapters in 2 Samuel. And now David's going to ask a question. He's looking for members of the Saul family. This sounds pretty nefarious, but we'll see whether it is or isn't. Ready? Here we go. This is a longer section. Is there someone who'd like to read, say, verse 1 through verse 6?
I'll do it if nobody else wants to.
Thanks, Sam.
David inquired, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul with whom I can keep faith for the sake of Jonathan?
I just want to explain. Jonathan and David, we know, were bosom buddies. They were incredibly close. How close is not clear from the text. There are all kinds of ways of reading the way they're described. It does say that David loved Jonathan, and that could be understood in a variety of ways. It's terminology usually used with regards to romantic love. However, that's what they have, this relationship. Jonathan has died, and so David wants to know, we had this promise to be true to each other, like, who can I transfer that relationship to? Okay, keep going.
There was a servant in the house of Saul named Ziba, and they summoned him to David. The king continued, is there anyone at all left of the house of Saul with whom I could keep faith as pledged before God? Ziba answered the king, yes, there is still a son of Jonathan, whose feet are crippled. King David had him brought from the house of Machir, son of Amiel, at
Lodavar.
And when son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, he flung himself on his face and prostrated himself. David said, Mephibosheth, and he replied, at your service, sir. David said to him, don't be afraid, for I will keep faith with you. It's bad enough I'm an old man and you move the screen on me.
Sorry, I didn't want you to get stuck. We're here.
At your service, sir. Don't be afraid, I will keep faith with you for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will give you back all the land of your grandfather Saul. Moreover, you shall always eat at my table.
Okay, let's stop there. So, what do we think of this offer? And what do we think of this recommendation of Mephibosheth?
It sounds good if you can believe David.
Yeah? Uh-huh.
I read the book before.
David's not always the most trustworthy. Okay, so it sounds good. We're going to take this guy. We don't know how old he is. He's old enough to speak pretty eloquently. And bring him into his home and feed him. And what do we think of that? And what do we think of the fact that the Ziba is saying, yeah, we have this one son of Jonathan whose feet are injured?
Why would you give away that information? Why wouldn't you just say, I don't know?
Well, sure.
You know,
what's the dynamic with Ziba? Is Ziba being a loyal servant? Is he trying to help? Is he trying to hurt? What's going on there? Yeah.
Well, it could be self-preservation, that he doesn't want to get on the bad side of the king.
Could be. Bad side of the king's not a good side. Okay. So Mephibosheth seems to be taking this offer genuinely and pretty sincerely, potentially. Mephibosheth prostrated himself again and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog like me?" The king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I give to your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and to his entire family. You and your sons and your slaves shall farm the land for him and shall bring in its yield to provide food for your master's grandson to live on. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Ziba had 15 sons and 20 slaves.
Wow.
Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do just as my lord the king has commanded him. Mephibosheth shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons." Okay, so let's stop there because it's going to get very interesting very quickly.
Very prolific, this guy Ziba.
What about Ziba?
Very prolific.
Yeah, definitely that. It's a lot of kids. We now have a little bit more information about him. He wasn't just a servant, he was a steward, which is a pretty high position in the household.
That was the same rank as Joseph.
Yeah. So not to be underestimated as a powerful force in his own right. And now they're continuing to be in this relationship, but instead of it being Saul who was the king, now he is expected to serve this guy who potentially Ziba doesn't think very much of, because Ziba makes a point to say, well, it's this son with the leg thing, right? That's how Ziba references him at first, not by name.
What did the steward do?
So David asks Ziba, like, is there anyone left in Saul's family that I can take care of? And Ziba says, yeah, there's a son of Jonathan whose feet are crippled, right? We're in verse 3 there.
I mean,
So
what was the job of a steward?
steward was in charge of the whole household. It was a position of respect and trust. And I wonder if that's how he would have spoken about this character before Saul and Jonathan had died. It doesn't seem to be the most respectful of language, and usually people are referred to by name, right? But not here. So why make the point to tell David that this son has this leg thing, feet thing, leg thing? The Hebrew is not clear. What would be the purpose? What might be the motivation?
Would it be
That he would
so
show
that
mercy?
that he wouldn't challenge him physically?
He's not a
Right.
threat.
He's not a physical threat, and potentially he's not a political threat, right? There was an understanding in the priesthood that you had to be physically perfect. You couldn't have any kind of blemish. If we were talking about the priesthood, this kind of injury would certainly disqualify Mephibosheth. The kingship doesn't have that kind of rule, but potentially the implication is that this person ain't gonna be king. He's not eligible. He's not appropriate choice. He's not a threat.
Couldn't lead an army.
Right. Certainly not from the front.
Right.
Not without maybe being carried, but we don't know also. We don't know the extent of the injury. We don't know if he broke both legs and they healed funny and he can walk but only very slowly, or can't walk at all. We're not clear exactly on the medical reality that Mephibosheth is dealing with. Science and medicine in Tanakh is not always the most reliable. We know that in Parshat Shmini, which we read last week, bats were in the bird category, which is not where we put them today. So who knows really what's going on? This is what we've got. This is the information that we have to work with.
We also don't know, because of this crippling,
Yeah.
how he was brought up. Like, maybe, they didn't bother to teach him, or maybe they did and he soaked it all in because he couldn't go out and play with or farm
Right.
or do anything else. So he became very smart and very,
We have no way of knowing.
yeah.
He could be incredibly tutored and maybe an indoor kid, or he could have been abandoned and very much in need of this kind of largesse and charity.
Well, he could become FDR.
Or he could. And what a threat that would be to David.
Right.
And so inviting the potential FDR predecessor into your home could be a political precaution as much as anything. This is someone I need to keep my eye on. I'm going to keep him close so I can watch.
Yeah. Keep your friends,
Keep your friends close and your enemy closer.
And we don't know, right? This could be either. And at this point, you might have a sense one direction or the other who is writing this text and who how we are meant to understand the character of Mephibosheth, whether we're meant to assume David is truly being so charitable and so generous and kind and open-hearted and sincere, or perhaps we're meant to ascribe a degree of political machinations to this and what's actually happening here.
But that's not really in David's background.
What is it?
He's not a nice guy.
No, he's not.
You know, he fought with the Philistines as their ally. He was was a mercenary, and he's very politically minded.
He is, and so are the people who are writing this text down, who are very much trying to preserve and lift up the memory of David and the dynasty that they are supported by, right? So that's all meant to be kept in mind for us. Maybe not the intentions of the writer, but that's what we're doing today. Okay, so we don't know how much time has passed at this point. And what the verse that we stopped on is going to show us that perhaps more time has passed than we think. Because if we scroll down, we learn in verse 12, Mephibosheth has a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household worked for Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate regularly at the king's table. Remember, he was lame in both feet. So this tells us a lot of information and doesn't give us almost anything. It's like very frustrating, like Tanakh often is. What do you notice about those very short 2 verses?
Well, he does have status because the members of Ziba's household work for him.
Yeah, he's got all that property and he's got all those servants and slaves now at his beck and call, apparently.
He lives in town, not in where his property probably is.
Right.
Or what that's, I don't know.
What else do we know?
He's had a regular relationship with David.
Yes.
Well, he has a son. Does he have a wife?
Oh, right.
Great question. And if he does have a wife, he has this son, which means that from a dynastic standpoint, even if he physically has been disqualified from the kingship, doesn't mean this kid isn't.
Right.
And was able to have a child. The child is named and apparently acknowledged, so presumably was begot through legitimate courses or whatever. There must be some wife, you imagine.
And they say again, lame in both feet. So
Right.
it could literally be from the knees down or from the ankle. I mean, we have no idea what the rest of him looks like.
Right. So we find out that his ability to continue the dynasty and potentially raise, even if he himself is not a political threat, for there to be a new heir for potential rebel forces to rally around, that possibility exists here.
I think the last verse is a little confusing, at least to me.
Uh-huh.
If it's meant to be contemporaneous, why did David go through the charade of talking to Ziba if Mephibosheth is eating regularly at the king's table?
Great question. Like, what good is all that land doing him if he's here, nowhere near it?
Well, and why would David say, you know, who's around that I can pay homage to for the sake of Jonathan. If Mephibosheth is already at the king's table, why did he go through that whole
So
charade?
this is probably another time jump. So we see that Ziba says, great, we're going to do this. This is going to happen. And then verse 12, there seems to be a gap.
Okay.
By the time Mephibosheth we don't know if Mephibosheth already has Micah when they have the conversation or if Micah comes later. Timing is not precise. We have no way of knowing, which is really frustrating.
We don't know how old Mephibosheth was when David took him under his wing, right?
I mean, if he waited from the time Mephibosheth was 5 until he was old enough to have a child of his own, then he doesn't seem to be that urgently looking for a member of the Saul family to take and house and take care of. It seems like...
So he must have still been a kid when David
probably,
reached out to him.
and maybe a very scared kid, and a kid who maybe is very politically savvy, because he demonstrates incredible humility in verse 8 when he prostrates himself and says, what is your servant that you shall show regard for a dead dog like me? You won't find children generally that humble. That's not how kids speak. I can say this from all my experience working with kids. I've never had one behave quite this fearfully or humbly. Like, this isn't how people react if they're not either very afraid or very much trying to appeal to a higher authority. And it is a little bit kind of like the little kid who's going to mom and like buttering mom up before asking for something. There's a little bit of that. Like, is he really that humble? He was the grandson of the king. And now he's calling himself a dead dog? That seems like quite I mean, there's been a change in status, certainly, but he was raised as a prince, presumably.
But he wants David to know that he's not a threat.
I would imagine so. Or David wants to portray Mephibosheth as so servile that he could never be a king himself.
Well, how did society see people who were disabled?
Great question. In the ancient world, traditionally people with physical limitations were apprenticed and worked in fields where it wasn't a problem. And we see this actually most clearly in the character of Hephaestus, who is very much not Jewish, who is a Greek god, Vulcan, in the Roman pantheon. He's a blacksmith, and he is the one who makes the lightning bolts for Zeus. But we find out very early that he comes out with some defects and physical impairments. And so he works as a blacksmith, which was often a field that those with mobility challenges worked with. Because your upper body is often fine. It's your lower body that suffers these kinds of issues, much like Mephibosheth.
So the question then is, did he see himself as a dead dog, or did he do it for political reasons?
Or did this never happen, but David wants us to see Mephibosheth in this way?
See, who would make up stuff? Never mind.
As I said, this issue of who tells the story and how accurate is the story and where's the power dynamic both has relevance in historically looking at the Shoah and also today.
The one who writes the books.
Right. Who will tell our story?
Even the people who write the books have to work with editors. And there is a certain amount of peer pressure that can happen. Stuff in Tanakh gets preserved that perhaps the writers didn't want to preserve, but was so popular you couldn't suppress it. There are a few examples of that in the way that the character Elijah is portrayed. Elijah is supposed to herald the arrival of the Messiah, right? But the way Elijah is portrayed is very much like a Messiah. So they didn't want Elijah to be the Messiah. They needed to finesse it a little bit so that there was some distinction made. And what we end up with is this sort of composite text. And potentially that's what we're seeing here with Mephibosheth. Maybe he was such a popular figure that they couldn't write him out. Although he looks primed to be written out. He's the grandson of a king, so he himself is several degrees removed. We don't know who his mother is. And he gets this injury that could be like story ending. You don't have very many instances of characters with significant disabilities being featured in the text. It's why he ended up in my thesis, because he's such a key figure. So, how are we doing?
Good.
Good and confused about who is telling this story and where the power is and why we're telling it this way? Great. The next part I've subtitled drama, because all your questions about what's going on with Ziba and what's the dynamic there, and Mephibosheth's not with Ziba, and that's all gonna erupt right now. Here we go. Would someone like to read?
Yeah, I can read.
Thank you.
David had passed a little beyond the summit when Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, came toward him with a pair of saddled asses carrying 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisin, 100 cakes of figs, and a jar of wine. The king asked Ziba, "What are you doing with these?" Ziba answered, "The asses are for your majesty's family to ride on. The bread and figs are for the attendants to eat, and the wine is to be drunk by anyone who are exhausted in the wilderness." "And where is your master's son?" the king asked. "He is staying in Jerusalem," Ziba replied to the king, "for he thinks that the house of Israel will now give him back the throne of his grandfather." The king said to Ziba, "Then all that belongs to Mephibosheth is now yours." And Ziba replied, "I bow low, your majesty is most gracious to me."
So
That's a big 180.
what do we think about this?
I don't know. I wouldn't trust, if I were David, I wouldn't trust Ziba. He may be telling the truth, but what is he going to do to me the next time?
Okay, in the what we just read, it said that he was eating at the king's table. Does that mean he wasn't eating with the king?
So the king is out doing kingly things around the kingdom, fighting
So
people.
when he has dinner in the king's palace at the king's table, he's not eating physically with the king.
Not necessarily. If the king's not home, he's not eating with the king.
Okay, because if not, he would know where he was. He would know he was in Jerusalem.
Of course.
Right,
And Ziba, not Ziba, Mephibosheth, as far as we know, is only ever in Jerusalem.
Right.
Because mobility is a challenge.
Right.
That's the thing they keep reminding us of, right?
Okay, gotcha.
So David seems quick to believe Ziba. What do we think about that?
Well, maybe David is looking for an excuse to get rid of that, because he's a possible challenger to the throne, and so this might be a good excuse.
Well, and David's been away from Jerusalem. Mephibosheth hasn't. He's been right in the capital the whole time.
I also think that David has his own set of spies. I mean, he's got more than
for
one,
sure.
So he knows what's going on. Maybe he's looking for validation to make sure that everybody's giving him the same information.
Do we believe that Mephibosheth has been doing this, or do we not believe it?
Doesn't matter what we believe, it's in David's mind.
For sure. But do we think David wants to believe it, or do we think David has like reason to believe this is real?
He has
He wants
reason
to believe it.
Getting rid of the competition.
Okay. He has reason to want to believe it, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
We don't know if Mephibosheth is legitimately loyal to the king and grateful for all the king has done for him. Or in fact, if he is inciting rebellion, he's still in Jerusalem. He could be stirring up all kinds of trouble.
Well, and his familial relationship is always going to be there. So the fact that he's descended from Saul and Jonathan is a fact. That isn't going to change. So he's always going to represent a threat, or his descendants, his line will represent a threat.
I agree. So whether this is real or not, whether Ziba is loyally reflecting the truth or not. How Ziba even knows, because Ziba's not in Jerusalem, is unclear.
Could-
Right, 'cause he's-
Could this whole thing not have really happened? It was made up to
Totally.
justify
Who knows?
what David did to
Yeah.
Mephibosheth.
So this
Mephibosheth.
is, I practiced for a long time. So this is circumstantial at best, hearsay at worst, at least it's hearsay. And Ziba comes out ahead. I think it's very
Ziba has the
clear.
reason to lie, really.
Absolutely. And Ziba has seen how quickly David is to like be, I'm going to take this guy and you're going to do this. And now I'm going to do something else. And when you're king, I guess you get to change your mind and make your decisions and no one's going to push them.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
So
It's good to be
we're
king.
going to see that David changes his mind again. This is just a temporary Ziba holding everything doesn't last. We're going to jump forward again a few chapters and we find ourselves in 2 Samuel 19. Would someone like to read?
Well, I could read.
Great.
Hope we pronounce everything correctly.
No worries.
Mephibosheth came from Jerusalem to meet the king. The king asked him, "Why didn't you come with me, Mephibosheth?" He replied, "My lord." "My lord the king, my own servant deceived me. Your servant planned to saddle his ass and ride on it and go with your majesty, for your servant is lame. Ziba has slandered your servant to my lord the king, but my lord the king is like an angel of the eternal. Do as you see fit. For all the members of my father's family deserved only death from my lord the king, yet you set your servant among those who ate at your table. What right have I to appeal further to your majesty?" The king said to him, "You need not speak further. I decree that you and Ziba shall divide the property." And both said to the king, "Let me take it all, as long as my lord the king has come home safe."
Let him take it all.
Or yeah,
Ziba, yeah.
let him take it all. Yeah,
So now what? Like, now what?
confusing.
Read.
It seems to be calling his bluff.
Yeah, very much so.
Agreed. Agreed.
So what do we think about this? What do we think about Mephibosheth and how he reacts and how he responds?
Is he trying? It looks like he's trying to butter up the king.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it's kind of reverse psychology. He's saying, well, I'll do this, but Ziba's the selfish one, the liar.
Yeah. But like, listen, you've already been so good to me. It's fine. Do what you've got to do. Even though he lied.
He's dodging the bullet.
He's trying to dodge a bullet.
Well, both of them, David also. This way he gets two guys who doing the same Shades of Solomon to come, dividing the baby, and
Right.
here he's dividing the property. So now he's got two people working that same, they're going to keep an eye on each other.
And can you trust any of them at this point?
Of course not.
I wouldn't.
No. I think up until this point, I always feel very sympathetic and like Mephibosheth has just been so mistreated. And then we get to this scene and I always have this moment of, oh, has he been like playing this whole time? Have I been played the way David gets played? I don't know. Would David want to be portrayed as someone who gets played? Would that be advantageous to his dynasty? Probably not. What do we do with this? Who's telling us this story?
Sort of like a mafia story in a way.
Yeah.
Is it greed?
Is what greed?
Do you think it's more power than greed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's power because I think wealth is one form of power.
Mhm.
How much land was involved that got given to him and then given to?
So it was all the land that Saul's family traditionally held. And Saul was king, so presumably a nice chunk.
Okay. So then how much land did David have when he became king? If he didn't take that same land when he became king?
Well, originally, Saul had Israel and David had Judah, and then David conquered Israel and got all of that too.
Okay.
But David's family was not in, I mean, like the tribes had different parcels, right?
Right.
So the families had different, they were nowhere near each other, really.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I'd like to think that Mephibosheth is pretty savvy in that he's playing psychological mind games with David, because what he's done, he's created this uncertainty, like who is telling the truth and who can I trust here? And so I think it's kind of brilliant. It might be, I'm not sure what his motivation is. I'd like to think it's pure, that he's been treated badly and he's trying to salvage what he can.
Yeah.
But it's clearly psychological mind games with David.
And I love the way this is the first time we see Mephibosheth say, and I have this injury, right? It's the first time it comes out of his mouth and his voice. In verse 27, he says,
right.
I was gonna go see you, but I can't do it by myself because remember, I have this injury. Maybe.
It's like an Alfred Hitchcock movie.
Who do you believe?
Very Machiavellian.
Yeah, I think
it could be.
Political theater.
Yeah.
And it is. It is political theater. These are real stakes. This is the king and the potential other king. Right? Everyone else in his family is no longer alive. So if you're going to have a Saul king, it's going to be Mephibosheth or some offspring of his. Because who else could it be? Or you could bring in this brand new bloodline, which happens at some point in the history books. I forget which one. You get all these weird dynasty changes, but not in Judah. Okay, so Mephibosheth seems to be working the system best he can, doing a pretty good job, which, whether or not he was educated the way you imagine, Elaine, seems to lend credence to the idea that he is certainly intelligent and savvy, whether or not he's been formally educated or not. He's been in Jerusalem. He's been at the king's table. He's been watching all of that for however long he's been there. And he's picked up on some things, at the very least. Okay. So before we go to this next section, which is rough and kind of gory, and I apologize for that, but I definitely didn't write 2 Samuel, so it's not my fault. What we're going to see is, if you thought it was Machiavellian before, we're going to get to some scapegoating in a very real way. So if this, I apologize, but this is Tanakh, so we're going to deal with it.
Years ago, called The Beginning of Politics, which dealt with this book.
Yeah, no, this is political. This is about power. This is about vice and greed and guilt, maybe. And yes, this is political. All right. I can read, I guess. Or would someone like to read? Okay. There was a famine during the reign of David, year after year, for 3 years. David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord replied, "It is because of the blood guilt of Saul and his house, for he put some Gibeonites to death." Okay. The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. David asked the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make expiation so that you may bless the Eternal's own people?" Thereupon, they said to the king, the man who massacred us and planned to exterminate us so that we should not survive in all the territory of Israel. Let 7 of his male issue be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Eternal in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Eternal. And the king replied, I will do so. The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, because of the oath before the Eternal between the two, between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. Elaine's face looks horrified. I'm sorry.
I'm
So who got the axe?
I'm glad I stopped eating.
Oh,
Who were the 7? Do we
Great
know?
question. We don't know from here. Let me double check. I'm going to switch real fast.
Well, we know there's a Micah.
We know Micah is Mephibosheth's son.
Right, that's why I was curious.
But he's in the line of Saul. So is he one of the people who's impaled?
Hope not. That's awful. Okay, here we go. This is the list. Instead, the king took Armoni and, let's really confuse ourselves, Mephibosheth.
The different one.
It was a very popular name. The 2 sons that Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, bore to Saul, and the 5 sons that Merab, daughter of Saul, bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite. We're going to go with that. Those are the 7. So we've got Saul's direct sons by a concubine, and Saul's grandsons by Saul's daughter. But not Micah, apparently. But this other Mephibosheth, just to confuse us. What I didn't mention is that Mephibosheth comes up in Chronicles as well, with a different name entirely.
He comes up with a different name?
Yes, because why should we be consistent in the same Tanakh? It wasn't the same Tanakh then. So in Chronicles, he's referred to as Mary Baal, but Mary Baal still has a son named Micah, and both of them get mentioned. This apparently is a different Mephibosheth.
Well, let's give the authors for 3,000 years a little bit of leeway, because there may have been a few hands touching these texts.
Yeah, for sure. Undoubtedly. There are definitely, these are composite texts, a lot of hands in them. And the name thing is challenging. The names often are not just names, they're implications of something about someone's character. Mary Baal is not a very nice name, nor is Mephibosheth. I'm going to switch screens briefly again and scroll up, and we see Mephibosheth means from the mouth of shame, and Mary Baal is an advocate of Baal. Baal is a pagan god, Canaanite god. So neither of them are particularly auspicious.
What did these 7 do to deserve a punishment like impalement, which was the Jewish equivalent, or this equivalent to the crucifixion? It was just as good.
They just were descendants of Saul. That's all it took. Because if we go back to that text, what was David trying to fix?
When they killed the
He's making sure there's no vendetta.
Right.
It's a famine. This is his explanation for how you fix the famine. Do you buy that this will fix the famine?
Sounds good.
Only if they have, silos full of grain that they're gonna share.
Right. Like, is this a trade deal? This is how we make it happen? No. God apparently says, well, you're getting this famine because Saul did a bad thing, and you got to fix the bad thing that Saul did. How convenient that Saul did the bad thing, and now we have to destroy all these descendants of Saul.
It sounds like David's writing this.
It sounds like David's writing this.
They should
So-
never have their Saul people king, because look what happens.
I mean, poor Saul. This family gets really, really. You know why Saul gets in trouble in the first place with God?
Why?
He doesn't kill enough stuff.
Oh,
He did what?
doesn't kill enough.
God tells Saul to kill everything in the valley, and Saul's like, we don't have to kill everything. And then God's like, I told you to kill everything. Now David's going to be the king.
I thought
That's
it was
what
the
happens.
Didn't he also go to witches?
He went to witches also, but that's not why he loses the kingship.
Oh, okay.
He does go to a witch. He goes to the witch of Endor, but he doesn't lose. Like David doesn't get anointed because he goes to talk to a witch. It's because he doesn't kill things enough. I don't have the verse right off the tip of my tongue, but I can find it later. It's remarkable. And David, who we know is not shy of killing things, clearly, certainly wouldn't make the same mistake that Saul made. So the rabbis don't know what to do with this. Like, really don't know what to do with this. This whole character, this whole interaction is incredibly problematic for them.
And a little negative, huh?
It's just really hard for them to figure out. David's like we say, David's going to be like, the Messiah is going to come from the Davidic line. This is the Davidic line. What do we do with these people? And they struggle. And in struggling to make David come out deserving of the Messiah coming from David, they're not very nice to my friend Mephibosheth.
Mm-hmm.
So now the story's been told. The history is written, but it hasn't been interpreted yet. And so now the rabbis are going to come in and they are going to tell their own version of this history. In the same way that for generations, we talked about Thanksgiving as this holiday where everyone came together and things were great. The rabbis are going to put their own spin on this history. So let's take a look at some of that. And since I started off negative, we're going to start off negative too.
Oh.
This is really long. There is a positive interpretation. It is considerably less meaty than the negative interpretation. So this is a lot, and we're going to work through it slowly. And we have about a half hour. Everyone sticking with me? We're okay? Awesome. So David's in trouble to begin with, because David has to be in a little trouble. David's doing all these crazy things. Rav said, didn't David accept a slanderous report? What are we referring to here? Ziba, right? Wasn't that wrong? And in accepting this slanderous report, didn't David do a bad thing? Didn't David do something he wasn't supposed to do? And now we're at Rav said, David accepted a slanderous report, as it is written with regard to David's search for a surviving son of Jonathan. And the king said to him, to Ziba, Saul's slave, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-Devar. So now, this is what the rabbis love to do. They see the name from Lo-Devar, and they are going to go in all directions with this, playing on the Hebrew. The verse can be read that after sending for him, David found him filled with matters, Melo-Devar, meaning full of Devar, full of words, full of knowledge, educated, as Elaine hypothesized. Meaning, we're talking about Torah, because the rabbis, all they care about is Torah. Now, after David saw that Ziba was a liar, meaning Mephibosheth wasn't full of Torah, once again, Ziba slandered Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. Why did David accept his report? As it's written that when David fled from Absalom, he met Ziba, and the king said, and where's your master's son? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he is staying in Jerusalem. As he said, today shall the house of Israel restore to me the kingdom of my father. We read that. And from where do we derive that David accepted Ziba's slanderous report? As it is written, then said the king to Ziba, behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. Shmuel is going to say, no, that's not slanderous. David did not accept Ziba's slanderous report without substantiation. He looked for evidence. It was just hearsay. And David himself saw conspicuous matters in Mephibosheth that indicated that Ziba was right, as it is written. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, and he had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he came back in peace. David thought that he was in mourning the fact that he, David, had returned in peace. And it is written, and it came to pass when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king, and the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And the king said to him, and he answered, oh, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me, for your servant said, I will saddle me a donkey, and I will ride on it, and go to the king, because lame is your servant, and he slandered your servant to my lord the king, but my lord the king is like an angel of God. Do therefore what is good in your eyes. So Mephibosheth said to the king, I had hoped for your return, saying, when will he come in peace? And yet you gave half my stuff away. It's not against you that I have grievances. I'm not mad at you, David, but I'm against God who brought you back in peace. Mephibosheth's own statement substantiates Ziba's report about him, according to the rabbis. This is what is written, and the son of Jonathan was Merib-Baal. The Gemara is like, wait a second, what's his name? And the son of Jonathan was Merib-Baal. The Gemara said, wasn't his name Mephibosheth? But he got into a fight with God for bringing David back safely. You are just like your father Saul. So this is a different interpretation of his name, Merib-Baal. This is saying he's not a master of Baal, but that he is fighting with God, kind of like Israel, right? We have the name Israel means wrestling with God, and this is saying you're quarreling with your master. God saved David, and so Mephibosheth is frustrated because David believed Ziba, whether correctly or incorrectly. Are we following this? This is crazy. It's like very confusing. So they're saying Mephibosheth is just like Saul. They both have this history of being associated with the word for quarrel. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and quarreled in the valley. Do you see that line? Here? So, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on. One moment, please. So now what? Had David not accepted Ziba's slanderous report about Mephibosheth? Oh, so I skipped a section. So Merib-Baal, Mephibosheth, same person. They both are frustrated that David so quickly believed Ziba, whether correctly or incorrectly. David has come back in peace having believed this report. And that's why, supposedly, he deserves to be called Merib-Baal. Now, the fact that David accepts this false report, they say is the reason that the current one kingdom, right, the united kingdom under David, doesn't stay united for very long. We end up with Judah and Israel, or Judah and Samaria. I can say the words, just not right now. We end up with the northern and southern kingdoms splitting up because David splits up this property. They say David made it happen. It's David's fault that the United Kingdom falls, not the one in Britain, this one. Had David not accepted Ziba's slanderous report about Mephibosheth, the kingdom of the house of David would not have been divided. Israel would not have worshipped idols, and we would not have been exiled from our land. So the rabbis don't exactly exonerate David, but they also don't say Mephibosheth was blameless.
Hindsight is wonderful.
Yeah, it's easy to be the rabbis. They don't have to deal with this.
Yeah, you can make the story. You can make the story fit the. You can make it fit the story.
Absolutely. And if we look at the earlier interpretation that I skipped, oh, it just got moved. That's so strange. My text got moved and I don't like it. Okay, so if we look at this one, very different. Now we're looking at David, who is so pious and so good. And the reason we know he's so pious and so good is because not only do I engage, we're in the middle of this paragraph here, in activity considered to be beneath the station of a king, but I consult my teacher, Mephibosheth, son of King Saul's son Jonathan, with regard to everything that I do. I say to him, Mephibosheth, my teacher, did I decide correctly? Did I convict correctly? Did I acquit properly? Did I rule ritually pure properly? Did I rule ritually impure properly? And I was not embarrassed. Forgoing royal dignity should make me worthy to be called pious. Now, what is this based on?
Person.
Yeah, it's a whole different person.
Yeah, that is not the same person.
No, that's not David that we know. That's a different David. It's a very popular name. I think they're just confused. Yeah, this doesn't feel like the same character. Also, we don't see him do this anywhere. Whenever does David consult Mephibosheth? Nowhere. He feeds him. He takes him on as a charity case. And he's suspicious of him enough so that he confiscates half his property. Property that in theory he should have owned anyways because it was his family's property and he was the remaining heir. So what are the rabbis doing here?
What are they doing?
I think they're trying to clean up poor David's reputation.
Yeah, I think you're trying to rehabilitate him.
Because something needs to change.
Yeah.
The person that we met was not this charming and not this humble. Also, though, it still feels a little like David, like he's posturing still. Aren't I so humble? I even asked that guy for help.
No, but that's the quintessential politician.
Yeah. So maybe it is the guy we know. Maybe the rabbis know David better than we think.
Why would he ask him for help rather than a Kohen? We had the priestly class by then.
Yeah, absolutely. Why are we even asking the king these questions? It's not the king's job. King's supposed to be ruling on legal matters. So convict or acquit potentially, but shouldn't the priest be dealing with ritual purity? That's not your job. Stick to your lane. But what do the rabbis love more than anything? A rabbi. So they're making David act like them.
Interesting.
Because a rabbi convicts or acquits on a Beit Din, and a rabbi rules ritual purity or impurity.
Okay, that's all right.
I like the fact that he said he wasn't embarrassed to ask. Did he do it right?
I mean, yeah, that's a admirable quality. You shouldn't be embarrassed to ask for help.
But you shouldn't have to tell people that you're not embarrassed. You should
Right.
just do it and move on.
Susan, what were you going to say? Oh, did we lose her?
They might have had to go. I don't know.
What do we think about this?
Do you know which one was written before the other? Or
Between the two interpretations?
Yeah.
I don't.
Okay.
Um,
All right.
that I don't know. Talmud, this is both Babylonian, and by the way, are the two most significant mentions of Mephibosheth in Talmud. Who he doesn't get a lot of attention. He's not a major figure. If you've never heard of him before today, there is a reason.
Okay.
Doesn't break my heart.
But for a character that never gets mentioned in regular conversations, he gets a lot of face time. He comes up and up and up in the Second Samuel. I mean, he gets more mentions for a character I'd never heard of than any other character I'd never heard of. Which is interesting. Because you'd think he's a threat politically. Oh. So why didn't they just get rid of him? Why does he keep coming up in the text? Why are they unable to just make an editorial change and edit him out?
Because they wanted to give us future folk something to think about.
You got to have more faith in us than that. We'd come up with something.
Yeah. What about his son? Is he ever mentioned again?
No.
Micah?
Nope.
No.
But a great question. And in fact, a question that an author not so long ago decided to try to answer. There's an excellent novel called The Secret Book of Kings. If you're looking for a novel to read and you like historical fiction, The Secret Book of Kings does an incredible job of really exploring the characters and the dynamics between these families, and goes into some detail about what happens to the Saul family. Where do they go? What becomes of them? It is speculative, it is fiction, but it is closely following the biblical text and very much interwoven with the biblical text. I liked it very much. And I actually recommended it for the book club, but I think I was overruled.
All right, thank you.
So if we have Mephibosheth, he keeps coming up. He's coming up in conversation with David and with Ziba. And this injury keeps getting mentioned. So what do we do with his injury? What are we to make of that?
Well, it's obvious that the injury is not as debilitating as it sounded.
Okay.
It sounds like the only way it's even debilitating is his ability to get around.
Which,
Yeah.
listen.
I mean, it seems like everything else is working just fine. You know,
Right.
he has a kid, he's, you know, having dinner at the palace.
Yeah.
Having dinner in my backyard, you know, so.
We all are having some challenges getting around right now.
Right. You know, so it, you know, when you first read it, you know, he's crippled, he's lame, you're imagining this horrible thing.
Yeah.
And sounds like, you know.
It seems that he was also a leader.
Maybe.
Didn't stop him from being a leader of people.
Right.
Well,
So-
at least politically savvy.
Very much so. I think we have to acknowledge that this is someone who understands vulnerability and understands power dynamics and is reading the room all the time. We see that from him over and over.
Yes.
So he came up in my thesis in the same chapter as Jacob.
Yes.
Why did he come up with Jacob? Because Jacob wrestles with the angel and he gets this hip injury thing that happens, right?
Right.
And for Jacob, it becomes this defining thing. And people talk about he wrenched his hip, and that's why forever we don't eat this tendon, and you can't have kosher filet mignon almost ever. And like all these, there's real repercussions for us, okay? But Jacob's hip injury is never mentioned again after that moment. And the language that's used is basically of a wrench or a sprain, or it's not the same language that we find with Mephibosheth. So Jacob has this defining injury that maybe isn't so permanent. Mephibosheth has this injury that we are reminded of over and over and over again. And are we meant to believe that it is so severe, or are we meant to discount him because of his injury? Who is telling us about this? Who is the one trying to help influence our perception of this character, who cannot be denied is clearly very bright and savvy and politically astute? Who is the one who wants us to believe that he is injured?
Ziba.
Maybe.
No, actually.
Ziba's the one it's actually most believable from. I think David or Mephibosheth I'd be suspicious of, but Ziba has
Right.
no reason to lie at
No.
that point.
Right. I mean, once you've already said there's an heir, you know, you've
Right.
opened Pandora's box.
Yep. So if David wants us to believe that there's this injury that's catastrophic, why would David want that?
Because it sets him up on a higher plane. You know, like I'm perfect and he's got this, he's marred.
It's the same kind of humility that we see in the Talmud text, right? Of like, I'm inviting that guy to my table. That guy's a mess. So maybe it's some of that same humility. Maybe David wants to be perceived as this charitable person, as this, maybe David wants to neutralize the threat of someone who mentally seems perfectly fit to be king. What if Mephibosheth's supporters are the ones who want us to think he's got this injury, are the ones who keep reminding us?
Well, presumably to generate sympathy or compassion or empathy.
Maybe. Feel bad for this poor man. He's suffered so much. He's lost his whole family. And he's got this horrible situation. He's relying on the kindness of others. It's like a Blanche moment.
But he's only relying on the kindness of others until he connects with David the first time. And
Right.
then he's got all this wealth.
But that's the kindness of David, which apparently is not consistent or reliable.
Right. True.
It's all over. It's all over.
It could be to neutralize being seen as a threat also, right? If they can convince David's supporters that Mephibosheth's not a threat, then he can still be a threat, but not perceived as one.
Right.
I don't know that if I were ruler of anything, I would leave a potential usurper in charge where all my power is supposed to be. Like I wouldn't have left Mephibosheth there. I would have brought him with me and put him in a wagon where I could keep an eye on him. I'm not going to leave him with all the courtiers who are already troublemakers, because that's what courtiers are. I don't know. I kind of secretly, not so secretly, I want it to be the Mephibosheth people who are like reminding us, hey, don't worry about him. He's fine. No, he's not. This is a smart, savvy person who maybe he's not going to be king himself, but he's not ruling out the possibility for his kid.
Right.
And I think to have both possibilities be equally compelling and possible, we have no way of knowing. It's one of the most frustrating parts of this part of the chapter when I was writing it, is I don't know. There's no way to know. Torah doesn't tell us. Tanakh doesn't tell us.
About when was this book written?
This is a Deuteronomistic history, so it's contemporaneous with Deuteronomy, which is like King Josiah-y, which is, I can't tell you, but it's later. Let me look. I'm sure I have that.
I think Deuteronomy was about the year 500, wasn't it?
CE? No. BCE?
No, I think, it was found later on.
Oh, it was found later, but Mishnah's 200 CE, so this has to be way before that. But let's see. Let's see what the internet has to say. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment while I do a quick Google. We'll see what I come up with. So so what are our takeaways from this for like practical purposes? If we're thinking about who's controlling the narrative, when you don't know who's controlling the narrative, how do we make sense of this?
Don't trust a politician.
Well, or get your information from many sources so you can kind of balance and find the truth somewhere among all the sources.
Mm-hmm.
I also think we have the advantage of seeing what happened in the future. You know, if Micah had become a king, then, you know what I mean? Then we could follow it a little differently. So we have the advantage of hindsight, but sometimes, you know, the more information you get, the more confusing it gets.
Yes, that is certainly true. So according to Wikipedia, which is actually, I will say, a reliable source in many ways, if we put the date that you gave us, Sam, and put it in BCE, you'd be about right. We're talking about the Samuel books being composed between 630 and 540 BCE.
And David's reign was,
Assuming it what well, we have coins, so we have that. That was before. Let's see if we can find that. It's a great question. Oops, that's the wrong King David. There's a lot of things on Wikipedia that start King David. Okay. Third king, around 1000 BCE. So we're talking significantly later.
so these people never knew David.
Oh, no, for sure not. These are not people who knew David. These are supporters of the Davidic dynasty. Generations
Making up
later.
stories about it.
What?
These are people making up stories.
Well, I mean, yes, but also there was the oral tradition is a tradition, right? There are stories that get passed down.
You can say the same thing about the gospel writers who never knew Jesus.
Sure. The distance between when they were written and when Jesus lived is different, though.
It's not as long.
No.
It's about a
30
40-year
years,
difference.
50 years, yeah. We're talking 4,000 plus years. Sorry, 400, not 4,000, 400. Let me get my numbers straight.
But we do have the Mishnah, which does mention this.
We have Talmud. This stuff was considered reliable enough to keep talking about. So I think what I'd like to close with today is the idea that we have this textual tradition. And like everything else, we can read it in many different ways. And as we read anything, we've got to ask who is telling us this story and what do they want us to believe?
Right.
Because all writing is political. This no less than the newspaper, no less than a news report. And we're meant to feel things and believe things when we read. So what is it we're being manipulated to think about in positive and negative ways? How are we meant to feel? Thank you so much for joining me today. I have Torah study this weekend, so I might see some of you on Saturday. Have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate
Stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe, stay healthy.